Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human and apparently Mr. CBS Sports Network. Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing?
I'm good. A lot of people want to bring up the CBS Sports hit. Like, I look like a slob, man. It was not good.
Maybe that's why they want to bring it up, because they feel that they're wanting to see you succeed, and they can't see you succeed if you're going to be wearing that shirt in the club.
It was brutal. Like I sat down to, like, it was I had woken up, I went back to sleep, and then I woke up again, and I was like, oh, I got to do this. I grab a shirt out of the closet. It's still dark, and I put it on. I'm like, okay, this looks good. I go downstairs and I turn on the webcam so I can have like a good, shot, like some like face doesn't like wash out and stuff like that. And it's like 10 minutes before the thing. And I finally get it, right. So that the lighting isn't like making it so I don't have a face. And I look down at my shirt and I'm like, oh no. And then they called on Skype and I was like, all right, we're doing this.
Yeah, be like, well, there's nothing you can do right now other than crap your pants and swim. Like, you're stuck in this. I like how Vikings Twitter was referring to it almost like Drew McGarry when he went on Chopped. Like, he got so much crap for his shirt. Like,
that's true.
Did you not listen to any of the content that was being provided? Because there was actual content there. But yes, mistakes were made in the wardrobe department. This is why either you need an assistant or to wake up a few minutes earlier before your obligations. That came off pretty judgy. I'm kind of proud of that. Welcome to this Welcome to this episode of Norse Code. We've got some stuff to talk about. We are going to go a little bit more in depth on the training camp stuff and all of the events kind of surrounding the decisions involving the social justice calls, some canceled practices around the league and other leagues, really. And then we also have a fantastic mailbag to go into. But before all that, just want to thank you guys so much for listening. Want to thank you guys so much for sharing Norse Code, whether it be over social media or just telling a friend, hey, take a listen to this. Again, really do appreciate it. We do have a new Patreon subscriber this week. Want to thank Matt Myrick. Again, thank you guys so much for joining. Patreon subscribers do get bonus content for most episodes that we put out. So if you would like bonus content, if you would like more Arif and James, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate $3.50 per month. Tree Fitty helps keep the lights on, keeps the Loch Ness Monster at bay, frankly. So you can do that. This episode's bonus content will include a breakdown of other teams in the NFC North and their training camp stuff. So if you would like to hear all that Arif is allowed to hear about the Packers and their training camp stuff, as we alluded to last episode, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and sign up there. Also, if you'd like to just donate a one-time donation, you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well. Before we get into the actual show itself, just a quick note that all of the drawings for the Norse Code Fantasy Leagues will happen on September 1st. So you need to get your information to me if you want to get into the drawing. As we are talking right now, it is Thursday, August 27th at about 9 o'clock. This will be posted sometime around midnight, so it'll be the 28th when it gets posted. You need to DM the Norse Code Twitter account your email address if you want to go into the lottery, into the pool of names that I will draw from in order to go into the leagues. Or you can email norsecodepodcast@gmail.com, and I can just get your email from that, put it into the list, and make sure that we're ready to go. Again, I will be drawing on September 1st. So September 1st, midnight, morning, that is the cutoff. That is it. We already have a ton of names in here, an absurd number of names, really. Today was a good day for for collecting.
So many. Good Lord.
We have
monsters.
This is so much fun. We have, and if you are a Patreon subscriber, we are doing a special Patreon league. So I am trying to get as well, and I say try to get as many people from Patreon in it. We already have more names than we have spots. So there's a special drawing just for that league. You are also eligible for the other leagues as well. So
quick note also. So every time we tweet out this league, people are like, "Oh, I would just not roster a kicker," which is like, yeah, we've thought of that. Thanks. So obviously, the penalty for not rostering a kicker is that you forfeit the game, and the penalty for not rostering a kicker who's active on game day is the same thing.
Yep.
I do want to say I think that rule should still be in effect for teams that apparently, like the Bears, I guess, might carry multiple kickers into the season. One that, like, just in case of like COVID stuff, I guess. Mm-hmm. If that kicker is not active on game day, rip, you forfeited. So you can't just like say, "Oh, the Bears have Eddie Pinero and whoever the backup to Eddie Pinero is. I'll just get the backup, and he's never going to kick, and I'll be fine." No, you gotta have a kicker who, like, clearly, you know, if they're in field goal range, that's who they're going to go to. Like, yes. That's obvious.
Yep, absolutely. 100% agree. I could not agree with you more on that, quite frankly. It has to be an active kicker that is going to be active that day. That
right,
is
yeah,
how
and if
that
they're
works.
they're both active that day and only one takes kicks and you have the other one, you lucked out. Congratulations.
Yeah,
They have to be active on game day.
You have found the one loophole in all of this.
Which would be an insane loophole for a team to like waste one of their 46 spots, but you know, their idiocy is your profit. So by all means, gamble on that.
Quite frankly, I would be impressed that teams were scheduling around my terrible rules in fantasy. I would feel just... I would have the same warm, fuzzy feeling that Arif gets when somebody on a national podcast refers to him as a Seahawks extraordinaire.
God, no.
I would feel that fuzzy feeling. I would just... It would be...
I'm not sure how much I appreciate the type of national exposure I'm getting now that I'm getting it. Now that I think about it.
I would be...
I'm a Seahawks fan who wears like just these awful slob shirts. It's great. Good job, Arif. You've really done a great job managing your brand.
It's almost what you're trying to. It's the hipster thing. You're just trying to show that you're so cool that you can rock that shirt and it's fine because your level of cool overcomes the shirt. That's what you're trying to. It's not working, but that's what you're trying to say.
I should have had like a super cheap pair of sunglasses on the entire interview.
I had an instructor in college who was wearing a beat up old Aquaman t-shirt and was hipster extraordinaire. He was a former, I say former musician. He was still a musician, but formerly a decent sized deal in the Minneapolis area and nationally a little bit as well. And he was rocking that shirt and was doing the full hipster look. And my only thought was, you are not, in fact, cool enough to be able to overcome that shirt, sir. There are certain things that Aquaman is able to defeat, and apparently that includes you. So, anyway, back to the Fantasy League. There is also a new rule I am instituting this year in that if your kicker misses a field goal, I believe within 10 to 20 yards, it might be 15. But within the first bracket of yards, if he misses that, you get minus 10 points. Because that's just ridiculous, and it's time to punish that.
And a lot of people might think that that's like really harsh, but if you just take a look at the number of kicks that occur inside that bracket, it's so few. There's so few kicks. It's just we're just adding, you know, more instances of the extra point thing. Honestly, it's so few.
Yeah, it's within 0 to 19 yards, so it's minus 10 points for that. So enjoy that. We have so overall there will be 2 leagues for people who are not in Patreon. There's technically going to be 3 leagues that are not for people who are in Patreon. It's like but they're like the main Patreon exists for the Patreon people, but Patreon people can also be like sprinkled into the other leagues. 2 of the leagues will have a reef in them for the normal leagues, and one of the leagues is going to have El Dusto himself, Dusty O'Connell, is going to be the other pro, quote unquote, in the league. So Arif and I are going to be in 3 leagues, and then in the other league, it's going to be Dusty and I. And I spoke to him.
Which means that every league is going to have 2 historical league champions.
Exactly. A win for one of us is a win for all of us. And as I said to, I was describing the changes to Dusty this morning, and he said, he said, quote, "Your king returns out of duty to his people." I swear I am not making that up. That
incredible. Oh my god.
To which I reminded him that a win for one of us is in fact a win for all of us, and he proceeded to cuss me out. So again,
you should have reminded that as a king, he should know that the Magna Carta deliberated all the responsibilities and titles.
This is why people listen to this show. We're 11 minutes in. We haven't necessarily talked about football, but we have talked about your fashion choices. We have talked about the Magna Carta, and we've talked about patreon.com/Norse Code. So that is going to be it for all of the shilling. Let's get into the actual training camp portion of today's broadcast. As you can imagine, with everything going around the country, as far as the response to what's happening in Kenosha, as well as various places around the U.S., including Knoxville, Portland, and now Minneapolis again, there are more calls for social justice. A lot of the leagues are having either canceled practices, postponed games. Some seasons are in absolute jeopardy from all of this. And the Vikings did make a social justice call. If you'd like to just discuss that briefly, they did end up having practice today, correct?
Yeah. So the Vikings had a very long player-initiated team meeting that took precedence over, took place of the normal meetings that they would typically have throughout the day. And the way the Vikings structure their practices is actually a lot different than most of the teams in the NFL, where most teams will have like walkthroughs and live practices and then the meetings. The Vikings kind of reverse that order. And I don't really know why that is, but it's been true since actually before Zimmer. But it has made scheduling, on our part easier. But it does mean that if something like this occurs, where something kind of knocks back the team meetings, then there's just kind of this larger cascade effect. And so they had those team meetings. It pushed it back. It also ended up pushing back some availability that Mike Zimmer was going to have with the media. And then it was kind of up in the air whether or not, as a result of that, whether or not there was going to be a practice. They ultimately decided that there would be a practice, and Kendricks went on the NFL Network, and among other things that he mentioned that they actually were going to practice. And so the practice happened. It was a longer practice. It was like 2 hours and then some, which by the constraints of like all the practices that we've watched is one of the longer ones. And mind you, we're not there for walkthroughs. So unlike previous years, we only get to see the practices. But yeah, that practice was mostly full speed. It wasn't that intense for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they had just come back from a day off. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons that maybe they could have decided not to take the practice off, because they just took a day off. They didn't bring that up in the Zoom call afterwards. But afterwards, they had Mike Zimmer and then Andre Patterson, who is on the Vikings Social Justice Committee. And then, of course, they had Eric Hendricks afterwards and Kirk Cousins at the same time. So on that call, they had a discussion about kind of the persistence of this issue and kind of finding ways to turn kind of the hopelessness of that persistence into hope for the future and finding ways to affect positive change. And on that call, there were kind of a lot of things that were good to hear. For example, on the previous social justice call that the Vikings had with reporters, there was not a lot said about Mike Zimmer's kind of approach or reaction, as the head coach, as somebody in charge, what his impact on the organization is as players kind of try to move this thing forward. He's going to be a big story regardless of whether or not you think that like politics is kind of appropriate to have in sports. And so we were finally able to kind of ask him because, people had talked about how, Zimmer had, made statements about how he was 100% behind his players and that he had learned a lot from working alongside Andre Patterson. And there was a little bit more. And Patterson ended up sharing a story to Mike Zimmer, who then relayed it to the media with Patterson's permission about having been pulled over with guns drawn on him at least 3 times that he's had in his life without any violation of the law occurring, without any citation, without any indication that he had broken the law or that he was ever pulled over for a specific reason. And so he shares that story, and apparently that did a lot to inform Mike Zimmer about kind of a lot of the differences that people face. And so with that, and then apparently other stories that Zimmer had heard from the players, including a very similar story to the one that Patterson described, that I think was good for us to know that Zimmer was active participant's weird, right? Because active participant in this context usually means people that are providing the shared experiences that people can learn from, and that's not really the same thing. But he was an active listener, I should say, and so that was really good to hear. What's interesting is that they were a little bit more explicit about kind of how political this can be, and I'm gonna for the most part on this podcast, I let kind of everyone knows what my political opinions are, but I kind of let the political analysis be on another podcast like Wide Left, and I kind of let it go here. But for here, I'm just going to give a couple of opinions just to contextualize the question I asked, which was that in the context of Zimmer talking about the specific problems that they were facing and kind of what solutions can happen with those problems, they brought up that this issue is not just an issue of police brutality against people of color and specifically Black people, but also an issue of these systemic and persistent inequalities that exist in a lot of ways. For example, educational resource disparity, income disparity, access to things like nutrition, and so on, and ways to kind of address those issues that also kind of impact the achievement gaps, whatever achievement gap you want to use. And so that was a big part of the call and how they wanted to address something kind of larger than that. And so, I asked, well, hey, okay, hold on. A lot of these issues have to do with politics. Like, even if you want to say stuff like this isn't, politics, it's human rights. And I didn't say this part, right? But, my point is, how budgets get allocated and who gets what resources is like the fundamental political question. Like, it is kind of where the original definition of politics kind of comes from. It's about how we distribute our shared resources. And so I was like, well, this is political. And you also mentioned, Mike Zimmer also mentioned, making sure that, we continue to elect politicians, or that we do elect politicians. Or he didn't say the word politicians, which I'm sure was intentional, but elect people to positions of power that have control over these things, that can effectuate the kinds of changes we need in these areas. Right? He was being very vague about it, and I was like, well, that sounds like political. Are you willing to kind of be more engaged on a very political level? And he said, basically, right? And I thought he was trying to be very careful with the question, which makes sense, right? Like, you don't want to say, well, now I'm a Democrat or a Republican or whatever, because you'll just screw a bunch of people and piss a bunch of people off. But, he ended up saying, like, yeah, I get kind of, insofar as we need to make sure that we continue to do research on ways to get people to vote and ways to vote for kind of the right people for those issues, and that people do that research. And so there was that. And then Patterson later on in the call jumped in and said, well, some of these are not political issues. It's not political to want to be involved in your community. And the part where my opinion comes in is I think it's all political. Like, I think that this kind of definition of politics is very constraining, and that we should be prepared to talk about how community engagement is also political, even if we're not talking about votes.
Going the full Baltimore Ravens in their statement,
right.
Which
and their statement was incredible.
Yeah, if you haven't had a chance to read it, it'll be listed in the show notes. They went at least 5 steps beyond what the Vikings were talking about. They
Right,
made
and
specific demands and called people out. The Vikings didn't necessarily do that. They were more talking about getting involved with things.
Yeah, and like things like community nonprofits and community education efforts. And honestly, so this is where I'm a little bit frustrated because it always feels like, and I don't want to impugn the intentions of anybody on the social justice committee. They obviously, have their hearts in the right places, and they're obviously very educated on a lot of these issues. But I think a lot of it, the way that it's relayed to us, and maybe that's not how it is in the meetings, the way that it's relayed to us, to me, is almost kind of small ball with regards to social justice. So, for example, a community drive to have volunteer teachers to teach children literacy and expand books is great, but that's never going to solve resource problems in schools. That has to be done through political avenues. You can mitigate education disparities, and you can save a child's life. Like, I don't want to say that you can't do good outside of formal political avenues. You can mitigate, right? But and you can save a child's life. Like, you can have an individual impact on individual people, and that's great. But these are larger problems, and so I felt like the Vikings were playing a little bit small ball, and so the Ravens just kind of went out there and they were like, Mitch McConnell needs to make sure that this bill is on the docket and that they pass it. You need to contact these people, and in the city of Baltimore, that this is their number for that. This is their number for that, and I think that that's great. It's actionable. It's specific. I disagree with some of it because it, has a fundamental belief in some of these institutions to work the way that they're supposed to. And I kind of have issues with that. But, my issues with the direction that they go in and the assumptions that they have about what they do, I think right now are secondary to the fact that they were very explicit about what things should be done. They obviously had a very productive team meeting as well. And one thing that the Vikings emphasized here is that they didn't want to skip a practice and have that be the statement because they didn't want it to just be kind of this 24-hour shock period. They wanted to do something that would be systemic and significant. They wanted to say not to knock other teams who did that, but I don't love the framing, right, of saying, well, I want to do something meaningful instead of skip practice, because I think there's ways to kind of combine that. And honestly, the Vikings have been very open and honest about the way that they feel about a lot of these issues, which is great. They've not been incredibly concrete about, and they don't owe it to me, but if they, so I'm not saying they owe it to me, but I'm saying from an evaluation of my communication with the Vikings, their efforts to have concrete long-term change have not been very specific about the ways they'll achieve it. Eric Kendrick said on the call, we talk a lot about problems, we need to talk about solutions, and I very strongly agree with that. And I've got my own, thoughts on solutions. That's on the Wide Left podcast. But what they were doing to kind of achieve those long-term solutions wasn't discussed a lot in the call. And so for a call that began with an explanation for why they didn't want to skip practice today, because of a desire to have a more concrete kind of movement, I would have liked a little bit more information about what that concrete movement is. Now, again, the Vikings don't necessarily owe me that, and they don't owe anyone an explanation for why they decided to practice on a day that everyone practiced. So I really like that they did provide an explanation and that these are issues they very clearly care about. This is just me evaluating kind of institutionally what I think about ways to engage in politics. But, obviously, first and foremost, it's good that they want to engage in things like human rights. I know that a lot of them think that human rights aren't political, and I understand the sentiment behind it because it really means that human rights should not be subject to political disagreement, which I think a lot of people can agree on. But I think because of that, they are political. And so I always want teams to be more aggressive. And the fact that the Ravens were much more aggressive about it, that was really great. But that was kind of what dominated the conversation today. And that's what a lot of the beat reporters talked about during practice. And we kind of were excited to see what the Vikings would say. And there was a lot that came out of it that I thought was really positive and great, especially, the stuff about, how a lot of people on the team, including Mike Zimmer himself, have learned a lot from the open dialogues that they have, which is not kind of an environment that any team that a lot of these players or coaches have been on have fostered. So that's all really great. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. It was such a big part of today and the amount of sports news we've had in the past 2 days, just sports news, just about sports kind of, has been extraordinary. I think we lived through a pretty historic moment yesterday in the sporting world. And so I wanted to lead off with that. But, a lot of you want to know like who the third right guard is or whatever. Yeah. We can definitely talk about that too, because that's the stuff I just do. So
well, yeah, and as I've mentioned to you on Twitter and on here earlier, it is interesting to watch the final 2 or 3 minutes of the Return of the King episode of the Boondocks kind of play out as we were as it was written there. So it'll be interesting to see if Oprah ends up as president at the end of the year. It's getting a little late for her, so we'll see. But the episode is phenomenal, by the way. In case you haven't seen it, the episode of the Boondocks includes an issue or a situation where Martin Luther King only went into a coma and didn't die, and then woke up in like 2005 and was very confused as to what was going on, what BET was. And I believe at some point he declared to Usher that Michael Jackson was not a genre of music. I think that was one of the better lines from the episode. But it's a phenomenal episode if you've never seen it. But yeah, there's a whole lot of blue language in it for those who are...
Yeah, we'll include it in the show notes, but warning, there's a lot of Boondocks language.
There is a lot of Boondocks language in there. But let's get into training camp stuff. And the first question I have for you is, what is going on with Danielle Hunter?
Yeah, so at the very end of the call, Mike Zimmer was like, man, I hope somebody has a football question. And we all kind of paused and we were like, okay, well, I guess this is the time when we ask about Danielle Hunter. And Courtney Cronin jumped in and was like, hey, so... last time you mentioned that Danielle Hunter was missing practice, you said it was just a tweak. Well, this is his 10th consecutive practice where he hasn't, participated. Is it still just a tweak? Are things taking longer? Has there been a setback? And he said it's a tweak. So he didn't say it's still a tweak or it's just he said it's a tweak. He very specifically mirrored the language from the last time. It's a tweak. You will find out on September 9th when the first injury report comes out. He very much did not want to tell us.
He's pregnant. He just wants to make sure that it passes the 3-month mark before he says anything. How good for him. I'm excited.
Congrats.
That is
I did
fantastic.
find it interesting that he said that. Just because it almost implies, it doesn't quite imply, but it almost implies that maybe this injury will last all the way up until the first practices before a game, because the game's on September 13th, I think, and so September 9th would be the first day there's an injury report. But I don't think that's actually what he meant, so I don't want to blow it up. But it does kind of feel like maybe he meant that practices that he still be kept out of practices. The thing is, I also don't think that there's an extraordinary amount of concern because he hasn't needed to rehab. He hasn't rehabbed on the side with any trainers. So it might just be, he pulled something and it's just taking a while for it to not be sore or something like that. But clearly this is a situation where the apparent treatment is time because they're not making him do extra rehab work from what we can see. So I guess I'm not that concerned yet. If he does appear on a practice report on September 9th, an injury report, well, yeah, then that's 3.5 weeks where he hasn't practiced. So, yeah, then I'm concerned. But for now, I guess I'm not overly concerned.
So, other than that, other than the question of what is exactly going on with Danielle Hunter, what has been notable over the past week in camp?
So, I mean, unfortunately, the past couple of weeks have not been remarkably high intensity practices filled with a lot of stuff that we can mine for highlights. But I think that the stuff that stood out, especially the past couple of days, first, I kind of wish Justin Jefferson would stop trying to one-hand all of his throws. or catches, I should say, because he's dropping a lot of them. And I'm not marking them as drops because it's like unnecessary, his like one handing. But he's dropped a lot of them. And I haven't mentioned this, I think, in a notebook or a podcast because it's more annoying than anything. But it's like a habit now, and he's doing it when he doesn't need to. He's not like stretching at way outside of his frame to play. I mean, once or twice he is, but most of the time he's one handing. He could have used two hands to secure the ball, and he's dropping it. It's very annoying. So there's that. But he did do, I think, a better job today of finding ways to get open. Mike Hughes, I think, has looked a lot better the past couple of practices, which is really good to see because it's been a bit since, he's done something like notable enough to generate kind of optimism. So there's that. I'll say that I think Afadi looks pretty good. I want to say that Jaleel continues to look, kind of surprisingly good. And I think that Brian O'Neill is really coming into his own as a right tackle based off of what we're seeing. And that's going to be kind of, great to see. Adam Thielen, it looks like, is shaking the rust off. I was a little bit concerned for like half a second that it was going to take a bit for him to do it, but now he's playing really well. Alexander Hollins continues to play really well. I think this is the first day, actually, the day we're recording Thursday, where he didn't have like an amazing day. He didn't have a bad day or anything, but this is like the first day where he didn't do something so notable, right? Which is interesting because that streak is like really curious to be able to have a really great showing in practice every single day you practice. And so this is the first day where he was just fine. But that's fine. That's good to see. Holton Hill has been extremely physical in camp. They finally started throwing flags on him. But we kind of discussed this on the sidelines with the other beat reporters, and maybe he's just doing the strategy where if you just always commit a penalty, they're only going to call like 3 a game. So it's he's doing a lot to cause some incompletions. He had some pretty good reps against BC Johnson. I think that there's a really good chance he's the best corner on the roster year one. So that's kind of exciting to see. As for the competition between Jeff Gladney and Cameron Dantzler, even though they're basically playing different positions, I don't know who the winner is yet. And so as we've been kind of discussing it on the sidelines with like other Vikings reporters, there was I said that I think that Jeff Gladney is going to be the week 1 starter. A lot of people think it's going to be Dantzler. And I think there's just really good arguments for either one of them. I think Dantzler just hasn't had the kind of day in the past couple of days that people have talked about a lot in the first couple of practices. And so I think that if the Vikings get to kind of say, well, both of them are playing well, I think they'll default to the first round pick. But, I think, I forget who, I think it was Matthew Collar raised a pretty good point. Like, well, or maybe it was Sam Ekstrom, but it was like, well, I mean, they've done this before, right? Like, when Mackenzie Alexander and Terrence Newman were rotating snaps, we were all just like, yeah, okay. And that might be what happens here, honestly, that the Vikings might just rotate snaps between the two of them. Dantzler's been playing exclusively on the outside, and when he plays, Mike Hughes plays in the nickel. I've also found something really interesting. Despite how poorly Mike Hughes' aggregate numbers looked last year versus, they were pretty good the year before, if you just take a look at his slot snaps, his aggregate numbers in the slot are actually really good compared to nickel receivers, or slot corners. Sorry, and so that's something to kind of pay attention to. Is that actually he was pretty good in the slot by the numbers at least. I'll have to double check kind of the times he actually lined up in the slot in the NFL, but that's good to see. And then when Gladney's in the slot. And then in two cornerback sets, no matter what, it's Hughes on the outside and Holton Hill on the outside. So there's that. Other than that, there just hasn't been a ton at practice. I think the more practice goes on, the more I think it's pretty clear that Nate Stanley's not an NFL quarterback. I think a lot of Iowa grads could have told you the same. He just doesn't look like I don't know why the Vikings drafted him, honestly. I mean, it's a 7th round pick, so it's not something to get too hung up on. I mean, they just cut their other 7th round picks, obviously, Brian Cole. So obviously that one was a worse pick. But I don't know what you can hang your hat on with Nate Stanley. And so I just think that these big arm Big Ten quarterbacks that they get, they're not always big armed, right? But they got Joel Stavey and Mitch Leidner and Wes Lund and Nate Stanley and James Vanderberg. which I can't believe that's a real person's name without it being a reference to Dawson's Creek.
Really?
Yeah.
Jeez.
But they're all like these Big Ten quarterbacks that are like the fourth quarterback on the roster. And the only time they didn't get one, Jake Browning, he made the team. So like, okay, cool. But they always seem to get one, and it never seems to work out because, your Big Ten quarterbacks are either like first round picks or they're busts. Like that's it. It's like either, you're a high, well, I guess Kirk Cousins, he's a good exception. But yeah, it's just kind of weird. But yeah, he's not doing all that well. I don't think Jake Browning has like lit things up, but I think it's pretty clear he's a better quarterback than Stanley. And Sean Mannion is pretty inaccurate, but it's very clear he's got a command of the offense in terms of where to put the ball and how to maintain timing. And so I don't think that Browning is going to be, pushing his roster spot anytime soon. So that's kind of my update. Overall, I like the cornerback group more coming out of camp than I did coming in. And so that's really great to see. I think that defensive line group there's a huge worry there. Even though I like Fadi and Jaleel in camp, I just don't know how much I can project that versus how much I like the corners and projecting them. In camp, Fadi and Jaleel Johnson are doing pretty well, but that other defensive tackle spot I'm really worried about. Daniil Hunter kind of being tweaked up. I'm not super enthused about. We'll see if anybody takes another step, but I think for this defensive line to be impactful in any way, someone's going to have to take a really significant step forward. And I think the most likely person for that is Fadi Odenigbo, given kind of how productive he was last year. But, unless they actually bench Shamar Stephen for Armon Watts, I don't really see necessarily how much this defensive line can get back to what it was last year. The Michael Pierce opt-out hurt them a lot. It's pretty clear in camp that that's happening, even though that offensive line is letting a lot of things happen. Like, it's not a super great look on the interior, and it's very weird to come out of a practice saying that both sides played poorly.
Uncomfortable. I think that is the position that the Vikings would find themselves in if both lines were just not doing well, especially to start off. Before we get into mailbag stuff, and I realize I was kind of a briefer overview of the situation, there have been some odds and ends in Vikings news that should probably be covered here, including the fact that the Vikings are not going to have fans for at least the first two home games, which does include the Green Bay game, which, I mean, the side effect, or like one of the effects of that decision is that there will be less people from Green Bay and Minnesota, and quite frankly, that's a positive. But it also means that there's no fans for the home game. So, what was kind of put into that decision as far as the state was concerned, and as far as the Vikings were concerned?
Yeah, well, it sounds like, and I'm not privy to the entire decision making process, so take this as this is my impression, not this is my reporting. But it sounds like this was primarily just a state decision. The Vikings, from my understanding, applied for 12 to 15,000 fans to the state for an exception or a waiver or whatever it is they need to apply for to allow for fans to appear at the stadium. And the state of Minnesota said, like, no. And I assume that in whatever application for an exception that the Vikings put together, they put together a very detailed plan for how they were going to do it in a way that minimized contacts and infections. So I'm not saying the Vikings were just like, yeah, 50,000 sounds like a good number. And the state was like, are you kidding me? I'm sure there was like an extensive process. And the state just has a rule that you can't have gatherings of over 250 people. And I find that kind of interesting, right? Because I think they both have a really great argument, right? Because the Vikings argument is probably something along the lines of, well, this 250 person rule is like for auditoriums of like, 10,000 or 1,000 people, right?
Not for buildings as vast as this.
Right, yeah. For a building as large as US Bank Stadium, calling it one gathering is accurate in one way, but not in the context of how closely people are grouped together, yes. Right? Like, so I get it, right? That's like a pretty good argument that like housing, 10,000 people in US Bank Stadium is significantly safer than housing 250 people in a 1,000 person auditorium. It just is, especially because, the fact that the Vikings can seat 65,000 or 70,000 undersells just how much space there is in there. Whereas with an auditorium, the seating is the space, right? You got the stage and the seating, right? And so there's an enormous bowl in the middle of all these seats, right? And so there's so much space, and the potential for ventilation is essentially the Jerry Jones Cowboys argument about why they were going to have fans in the stadium. So I imagine that this was like a big part of it, right? And I'm confident that the Vikings, have their own medical expert on staff that helped them with this proposal. And the state, from my understanding, again, not reporting, but from the way I've read things, just basically said no. And that, I think, covers maybe the month of September or up to a certain point. The state of Minnesota keeps on saying, these are the rules up until this date, and on this date we'll revisit it. And then like 2 days before that, they say, okay, now these are the rules up until this date, and then on this date we'll revisit that, and so on. And so I think it's either the end of September or some point after that, or some point after the second game, home game that the Vikings have, that decision is made. And so the Vikings have decided to be cautiously optimistic and say, well, after that point, maybe they'll also be able to kind of revisit our application for a waiver for this rule. And if the state, just said rules are rules, that would be kind of disappointing. But if they, made an argument along the lines of, well, maybe it's true inside the stadium, but if you have a game and people are allowed to come, there's going to be a bunch of people gathered outside in close proximity to each other, like tailgating and stuff. And we just can't have that. So even if your procedure is great, we can't have you encouraging people to come and violating procedure outside of the parameters that you can control. If they said something along those lines, maybe, I don't know if they did or didn't, I guess that would make more sense. But if they were just like rules are rules, that'd be a little bit disappointing. So that's the state of things. I think it's mostly driven by Minnesota and not by the Vikings in terms of not having fans for the first 2 weeks.
The other big news that happened over the past week was a number of false positive tests ended up going out, and the NFL kind of recognized immediately, hey, what the hell is going on? But this did affect, unless I'm mistaken, just about every league or every team in the league.
Well, not quite, actually. I think it primarily affected 10 or 11 teams, which is interesting.
That's what it was. Yeah, it was more than a few, because all of a sudden even the Vikings had like false positives on it, like that, for people that were immediately retested, and it turned out they were fine, and it was just a contamination at the lab.
Yeah, and so what had happened is that the testing firm that they use, which I think is called BioReference, has a number of labs across the country where they do polymerase chain reaction tests where, some of you probably did this in high school, some of you might not have, but it's actually a fairly simple process to get the DNA to express itself, or in this case, RNA to express itself in a gel, but it just takes some time. But it's a fairly accurate test if testing procedures are followed. And so that's why there's like a 24-hour turnaround, but that's why there's so many available, so long as you have like the testing samples and the gels that you need and so on. And what had happened is on gathering and entry into the lab, apparently some testing procedure was not followed, and the samples were all contaminated. And so like 11 or so or 10 teams had like a dozen personnel, players and coaches, come up with, positive tests. And the NFL figured out really quickly, all of these results are coming from one lab. No other lab has reported a single positive, which is like also pretty notable. So that's great. So this seems like it is likely a sample error, some kind of contamination of the sample. Something happened at the lab. And so to the NFL's credit, or to the individual teams involved's credit, all of them took precautions to say, well, everybody who tested, this doesn't mean that because this test came out positive that, and it probably shouldn't have, it doesn't mean that you don't have it. So everybody here is going to be, separated from the rest of the team in the facility, and they could go on the COVID. I don't think they went on the COVID reserve list given the unique nature of this, but they will treat them as if they have it, knowing that it's likely that they don't. And so some teams canceled practices out of an abundance of caution or whatever the phrase is. Some teams delayed practices so they could figure out what the procedure was going to be. The Vikings actually moved practice indoors, which you would think, hey, that's the opposite of what I would do if I was worried about the potential for a contaminant to be floating around. But actually, they just did it for weather reasons, and it had nothing to do with this testing thing. And so it was just like, yeah, well, those 8 players are not going to be there, so who cares? But yeah, so and they figured it out, and I guess so. Not a single player ended up with a positive test upon retesting. I think some personnel for some team, I don't know who, and they probably won't disclose who, did end up actually having positives. But I don't know if it's from the group that was in that lab or just kind of incidentally at the same time. But yeah, no players tested positive through that round of testing, which is really good news. It's just kind of weird that this happened, and it's something to, make sure that we pay attention to, especially because this is very public facing. And there are open questions from people about the reliability of COVID testing generally. So really sucks that this happened, but also really great that they got on top of it. But it's also pretty important to note that this doesn't happen if there's not a centralized body, right? Like the NFL. Like if 1,000 people get tested and they get their test sent to this lab and they get told that they're positive, that's better than a false negative, I guess. But it's just no one would have caught that probably.
Yeah.
So that is notable too.
I had a COVID test in, I want to say April, and the initial, it wasn't even mine. It was my wife's, and the initial worry was that there might have been a problem with the test because when it went out to the lab, one of the machines had broken down, so they were being really slow, and there was a question of contamination or whatever, so they weren't positive whether or not a negative or a positive test was going to be accurate. And so I ended up getting a COVID test immediately after that and be like, well, I also feel like crap, so can we do this too? Because I'll feel better about her negative test if I can get one as well. And it ended up being negative, and 2 negatives is pretty clear, but these things do end up happening, and it ends up kind of bringing into question the whole accuracy of what they're trying to do. On the plus side, if there is a plus side to all of this, the NFL, at least the teams and the players, seem to be doing a remarkable job so far of keeping themselves from getting the virus, and kind of keeping to themselves, but keeping within the bubble of their team.
Yeah, the NFL has kept positive rates down, and they've kept the number of people going on the COVID-19 reserve list down, which are highly correlated, but not the same thing. Hopefully they'll keep it up once games start. The biggest concern was that this is a pseudo bubble and not a bubble, because players still get to go home to their family, and their family might be going out, and, stuff like that, which resolves the mental health concerns, right? That was it Paul George was talking about with regards to
George was talking about that, and NHL announcers were talking about something entirely different as far as what people were missing inside of their bubbles.
Distractions, one would say.
Yes. That's Rocky's coach in the Rockies movie would say that it makes your legs weak, but nonetheless
makes your legs weak.
That was what he said. He said women make your legs weak.
Said.
Yeah,
that's what he said.
Yeah.
So some fighters believe the exact opposite, I've learned.
Well, yes.
Because there's some very frank interview questions in UFC.
For a while, UFC just let anyone get a press pass. So some of in the early to middle age of UFC, some of the questions that got asked during roundups were just amazing. You don't see it anymore because they're all, we're on ESPN. We have to have legit people come in. We
can't ask about these kinds of pregame rituals anymore.
Exactly. We can't go that route. However, We can't ask Mick what he feels about this, despite the fact that Mick might actually be like an ethnic slur here. We're going to ignore that and ask him. Oh, but yeah, in the old days, you used to be able to do that. Now they're all on ESPN and corporate sponsors, Adidas shorts and everything. You can't ask those questions. And the one, which is funny, because the one super accurate reporter that everyone trusts the most about the sport isn't allowed to really cover their shows in person, which I still think is funny.
Is that Ariel Helwani?
It sure is.
Even I know who that. Okay, wow.
Yeah, he managed to piss off Dana White to no end. I think oddly enough, with a Brock Lesnar thing, he had broken news of, and he did not like that at all. So that was the end of him reporting in person for UFC stuff. So anyway, we're going off topic again, because as much as we complain about preseason games, and we have at great length, if you've listened to the show for the last 6 years, you would know that, but it does take away a bit of the content that we would otherwise be using, because we'd be breaking down, hey, this is what we can see from the lineups. We can see Browning is struggling but doing fine. Kirk appears to be okay with his one pass that he threw for -2 yards in a sprint that wasn't his fault. He was just trying to get CJ Ham involved, and Ham tripped. Fine. We probably won't see anything from Dalvin until week 1, like that sort of stuff. But as a result of the no preseason games, it has kind of cut a bit of the content that we would normally have for these episodes. So I wanted to just quick apologize for that, but we do have a massive mailbag to get to. But before we do, we are going to go over to Patreon. So if you subscribe to Patreon, you will just get this just automatically, magically, just slowly segued into your feed, where we're going to talk about the rest of the NFC North and a bit of what their training camp stuff looks like. So if you are not a subscriber to Patreon, we'll be back with the mailbag in just a moment. All right, let's go into the mailbag. And the first question is from Ryan, who asks, why have the Vikings been bringing in so many bottom of the roster linebackers? Seems like they've only got one open spot, assuming Gideon doesn't come back.
Well, you have to understand that in a typical 90-man camp, they've got 9 or 10 linebackers that are practicing. And so their third team has 3 linebackers that are distinct from their second team. Right now, the Vikings have their second team linebackers pulling double duty and also playing on the third team, which means a super wasted opportunity to keep your files updated and have additional notes on like other players that you would sign in case of an emergency. Like if, 2 linebackers go down, right? Like if Eric Wilson goes down and Eric Kendricks goes down, now you've got to promote like Troy Dye and, Jordan Fair or whatever, right? Ben Gideon might be on IR, and now you've only got one other linebacker on the roster. Like you have to sign somebody, right? And preferably you would sign somebody who you know who they are, right? Because you've had a couple of practices with them and they're familiar with your playbook. And so that's part of it. And the bottom of that linebacker group might still include somebody that can impress, because you still want your depth to be good. And so you want somebody to be challenging Blake Lynch and Troy Dye and Jordan Fair. Like you want somebody that can actually put pressure on that end of the roster. Otherwise, you're just left with who you're left with. There might not be spots, right? There might be like 6 linebackers in camp and only 5, spots available during the regular season. But that's true at every position. The point of camp is to have as many bodies as you can, not only to evaluate them for whether or not they make your initial 53-man roster, but to evaluate them so that mid-season, if there's an emergency, you've got somebody you can go to. And even then, like, it's not even just to evaluate them for that. It's also to just kind of make sure that you've got everybody fresh when you've got your reps ready to go, that you've got, an appropriate amount of competition so if people feel pushed to compete. And, you've got enough bodies in your special teams practice to actually conduct special teams practice. So there's a lot of that kind of going around. But, like, no one is shocked that they keep going through these guys because – Quentin Poling went on injured reserve. The Vikings thought that DeMarquise Gates wasn't a good fit, so they let him go. And so they continue to bring in these guys. Note that when they bring in somebody else, they're cutting somewhere else on the roster, right? So they brought in David Reese, and they cut safety Brian Cole. And so it's very clear they want to expand the number of linebackers that they have available to them. So that's why, like, having 6 linebackers in camp is just like not ideal. Like, they might have 9 or 10 defensive linemen, but in camp, they've got like 12 or 13, right? You don't like typically have camp start with only one more player at the position than you're going to roster, except at quarterback. So even at running back, they've got more than the number that they're going to end up with. So I don't think that that's unusual at all.
All right, next question is going to be from Richard, who asks, "What's going on with the backup safety position? Lots of players being brought in from free agency."
There's another question about a lot of players looked at. They only brought in one player, and that was actually off a waiver, Stephen Parker. And they just cut another player. So I think it's just, hey, you've got Harrison Smith and Anthony Harris, and then who do you have behind him? That's what's happening. You have no idea who's behind them. I've been impressed with Josh Metellus, but he's a rookie, right? I've not been crazy impressed with Miles Dorn. Stephen Parker's like, as soon as they brought Stephen Parker in, he was on the second team. That tells you kind of how confident they are about those rookies. It was Nate Metters, who's listed as a cornerback, but has played a ton of safety for the Vikings. Nate Metters and Stephen Parker at the second team safety spot. So that's a pretty clear indication that they don't have a lot of answers for what they're going to do at depth. And if they've already decided that Brian Cole isn't a great fit for whatever reason, then, their kind of updated file on available safeties they can bring in is not crazy deep. Like, yeah, they worked out George Aloka, fine. They didn't end up signing him, though. But they might later in the season. But it'd be nice to have as many names as possible on that list. I asked an Eagles reporter about Marcus Epps. He's been injured all camp. Sounds like he might actually hit injured reserve. So that's too bad because the Vikings could have used him. But yeah, I don't think that there just is any reason to be confident in that safety group backing up Anthony Harrison Smith.
Big Tony asks, "Is Kirk Cousins the last of the generation of cerebral, statuesque quarterbacks? All of the good young quarterbacks seem to have more athleticism."
I mean, kind of. It kind of depends. Like, do you think of Matt Stafford as a statue quarterback? And I think most people would say yes, but he has athleticism and he can run. Cousins is kind of the same way. He's not as athletic, but he's more athletic than your standard like Zach Mettenberger or your old Peyton Manning or Tom Brady type quarterbacks. Like, he's got more athleticism than them, and he can scramble and he can move a little bit. But he's kind of in that mold of just like an athletic enough quarterback that you can move him out of the pocket and have him throw on the run. Are there people kind of like that? I think on that scale, you're not going to, see them win many plays with their legs, but you can move them around in the pocket and stuff. There's, quite a few quarterbacks. You've got like your Derek Carrs, your Teddy Bridgewaters, right, is kind of in that category. And you can kind of go around like Jameis Winston is in that category. Those quarterbacks just kind of like exist around. And then you've got, your scramblers like your Baker Mayfields, Kyler Murrays, and Gardner Minshew's. And then you've got, your scramblers with plus athleticism like Patrick Mahomes. And then you've got obviously Lamar Jackson kind of in a tier of his own, separated by a couple of units. And then, somewhere in there is healthy Cam Newton. But for people that are like, young statue quarterbacks, it depends on what you think of Jared Goff. If you think he's a good quarterback, he is a good example of a, kind of brains only, arm only quarterback. He had negative rushing yards in college. Which, I mean, in college they count sacks as rushes. So keep that in mind. But a good barometer for whether or not a quarterback is kind of that statue kind of guy is whether or not they had 50 or fewer rushing yards in college, which includes the sacks. So Jared Goff is an example of a person who had negative rushing yards. Josh Rosen is another example. Obviously, he's not doing very well. So, maybe the NFL should just shy away from these guys because, Jarrett Stidham kind of, but they just replaced him with, the classic athletic quarterback, Cam Newton. And then Sam Darnold, I think, is another example of that, where he can move around in the pocket. He's kind of like Kirk Cousins-ish, but, his movement is so limited. I think he had 108 yards rushing last year in college. So, or not last year, 2 years ago in college. So he's kind of like that. if you think he's poised to break out, and I've made fun of him, I don't think he's a particularly good quarterback. Jets fans in my mentions have actually made some pretty good arguments about this, where he was the most pressured quarterback in the NFL last year. I checked that. That's true by a couple of different charting organizations. If you only look at his performance in a clean pocket, and clean pocket performance is more stable than any other kind of measure, then he was actually like 19th or 15th or something like that, which is pretty good for the situation he is in. So there's an argument that he's actually secretly good. I don't see it, but I think that there's an argument. So there's a couple of those quarterbacks in the draft. Who are the quarterbacks in the draft? Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence. Neither of them count as that. Although I think if Trevor Lawrence didn't have that gigantic run in the national championship game, people would be considering him more like that. I think if you're an NFL fan, I think if you're a college fan, you're probably more familiar with what he can do and what he can't do.
Like how you're not even going to mention Jordan Love, like he doesn't exist in the first round.
Well, he's got some athleticism. He's more of a scrambler type.
Are you going to? I thought you were going to say he's more of a dancer type based on his footwork from the first couple of days.
Yeah, but he can move a little bit. He was compared to like Patrick Mahomes by somebody. I was disgusted.
Who on earth, and can they have their Twitter account be taken away?
It's just, it's the draft, man. People get real dumb around the draft.
That is not a good enough excuse for that sort of take. How dare you, person who I don't know? All right, sorry. Let's go to MD, who asks, how concerned are you about this disjointed offseason in conjunction with so many new faces?
Pretty concerned. I think it's pretty clear that this amount of offseason work is the previous amount of offseason work was actually pretty necessary based off of what I'm seeing in camp. And the fact that the Vikings don't feel like they can trust a lot of the new faces that they've brought in is really alarming and concerning. And I think some of that is just driven not by, hey, we brought in the wrong young faces, but more by the fact that they just haven't had time to learn the offense, the defense, or whatever. And so you're throwing people out there that just haven't had time to warm up, that haven't had time to learn the defense, that haven't had practical instruction on what it means to be on the offense, the defense. So it's one thing to know what the playbook says about an option route, and if a cornerback is leveraged this way, that you should go this way on this play on this option route. But on this play on the same option route, a different leverage will mean different things because another route, it's one thing to see that in a playbook. It's another to play it out on the field and see physically what that looks like and know kind of intuitively, oh, well, I always know actually when the spacing feels like this, I should do this. And they haven't had that opportunity, right, at a bunch of positions. So I think it's really concerning because the Vikings have brought in, like you said, a ton of new faces, primarily through the draft, right, or undrafted free agency. But they need some answers at a lot of positions that, last year weren't as dire, right? I think we were pretty comfortable with what was happening at edge rusher. We had our concerns about Everson Griffin, but we're pretty comfortable with what's happening at edge rusher. We were pretty comfortable at nose tackle. We were like, hey, they've got the best receiver duo in the league. Ignorant to what Mike Evans and Chris Godwin would become, I guess, and to what Adam Thielen's injury would be. But and then, hey, you've got a great 1-2 punch at tight end, and we're familiar with all these offensive linemen. For the most part, and, hey, Xavier Rhodes might have a bounce back year. Trey Waynes is going to continue playing as well as he did last year. And Mackenzie Alexander actually, second half of the season, did pretty well. So we all know who all these people are, and we're very happy with that. And now we're just like, yeah, I don't know who the starting end is, or the nose tackle, or the under tackle, or any of the three corners. Who the hell is that guy? There's a lot of new faces. So I think that is a pretty big concern. I think it's a bigger concern for the Vikings than it is for a lot of other teams.
Jet Season asks, any updates on Courtney Davis?
Nope.
All right. Rob asks, what is Dantzler's weight looking like compared with the other guys? Do you think it could be an issue as far as tackling is concerned?
Yeah. So Dantzler weighed in at 180 at the combine. He was purported to weigh 160 entering college and got all the way up to 170 soaking wet. And did really well, I guess, in college. allowed 22 yards against LSU and Alabama combined, right? Like that's the thing that the PFF people that really like him like to talk about. And obviously LSU and Alabama had the best receiving corps in the country. Apparently bulked up for the combine, bad decision, ran a 4.68, lost a bunch of that weight, ran a virtual pro day, and purportedly ran a 4.38. I wrote a bunch about how weird all of that was. But how is he looking in camp in terms of weight? He looks pretty skinny, but he doesn't look as skinny as Alexander Hollins did. So there's that. So I guess he's probably bulkier than the 166 that Alexander Hollins weighed. But he looks pretty skinny. And it kind of sticks out. Like, he wears 27. So sometimes I'm just like, what's Jaron Kearse doing here? But Kearse was a super lanky guy, right? So sometimes it just kind of feels like that. But I would not be as concerned as far as tackling goes. I would be more concerned about his ability to push physical receivers through the sideline. And that hasn't shown up at camp, like thankfully. Like he's looked pretty good when it comes to the physical part of the game. But I think that once the NFL season starts, how that translates is going to be a pretty big question because the Vikings don't really have a ton of like Allen Robinsons to really test this theory out on. And they'll be going up against Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay and Allen Robinson and Devontae Adams and so on. So, Thielen isn't really like Thielen will always commit a light pass interference at the top of the stem. But it's not really the same as like Allen Robinson saying like, I'm just going to win by being bigger and stronger. And I don't really care if I get open, which, I mean, he does get open a lot, but it's not the same. So I would be concerned, but those concerns haven't necessarily materialized in camp. Also notable, there's no like live tackling in Vikings camp. So if he's a bad tackler, I don't know yet.
All right. Next question is from Raul, who asks, question for the professional writer. Clever or corny to call completions on Dantzler threading the needle?
Both. Definitely both.
Seems like a decent answer. Vikes Ginger asks, what projected starters have the shortest leashes? Will coaches be quick to swap in a new starter at offensive line, defensive back, defensive line, if someone struggles mightily?
I would say, so I'm projecting Dakota Dozier to start at right guard. I would say that he probably has a really short leash. Probably good evidence of that is the fact that he hasn't won the position yet. So there's that. It sounds like Shamar Stephen has like the strongest job security on the planet. Otherwise, I would say him. But like Armin Watts is like really good. So I would hope Shamar Stephen is on that list. It sounds like based off of what the Vikings say, he's not. But that's something to consider. And then I would say that neither of these guys have a weak or a strong leash. But I already mentioned the Jeff Gladney, Cameron Dantzler battle. And so they're going to be rotating through. And I assume if someone like screws up in a big way, that game, they're probably going to be losing snaps to the other one. So that's what I would say there. I wouldn't say like if BC Johnson is like really bad for the first couple of games, we'll see a lot of Justin Jefferson. So in that sense, he probably has a pretty weak leash, but I don't expect that to be the case. Like I expect Dakota Dozier and Shamar Stephen to struggle. I expect the rookie corners to have a little bit of difficulty from time to time. Based off of what I'm seeing with BC Johnson, if he just sucks for 4 games, they'll play Justin Jefferson. So in that sense, he doesn't have a very strong leash, but I don't expect that to be the case.
Next question is going to be from James, who asks, BC Johnson's been getting a lot of praise for his camp. What is the likelihood he'll get to 1,000 yards receiving this season if he continues on this trajectory?
So like this is kind of a trite answer, but like it depends on how much the Vikings throw the ball. But I think that that's a really open question because I think that the Vikings are poised to throw the ball a lot more. That's what my national hit on CBS Sports was about, because Kubiak does have a tendency to throw the ball a lot more than people think. The Vikings were the second least pass happy team in the league. Behind like the Ravens, who like averaged as many yards per run as some teams do per pass. So like, who cares? And so there's probably some regression towards passing, especially with the defense kind of moving in the other direction. So they'll probably throw the ball more. If they throw the ball like 450 times, does BC Johnson hit 1,000? I don't think so, because I do think there is going to be a rotation between him and Jefferson. Like I think BC Johnson has the starting wide receiver 2 job, but I don't think that means he gets 1,000 snaps. But I could very easily see 800 for him, 600 for Jefferson. Like I could totally see that. And then I could see Thielen getting like 1,200. I don't know how this all adds up. If like you add like 600 from Irv and like 350 for Kyle Rudolph, if like I've accidentally made 5,000 yards for Kirk Cousins or something, but these are the numbers that I feel in my heart.
We'll go with that.
I hope it's helpful.
I don't think we've ever ended a question like that before. So I'm just taking a moment to take all that in. Okay, well, Kyle Slaby asks. People started listening to this because it was a numbers podcast. So you'd go off for hours on stats and deep dives and everything. And now we've transitioned to your heart. All right.
Well, my heart was about the numbers.
And apparently now it's not. Kyle Slaby asks, is there any quote-unquote standard fantasy football score worse than pick sixes and fumbles for touchdown counting against a defense/special team starter?
There probably is, but I share like your annoying, like how annoying that is. Like I share that. Like that sucks. It super sucks.
What really sucks is when you're in a league where kick returns count, and you may not have known that kick returns count.
Yeah, if you don't know, that like blows. But I always check to see if kick returns count. So I always grab whatever wide receivers are also projected to be kick returners, which doesn't matter anymore because no one returns kicks anymore. But
no,
I loved it because no one checked.
Yeah. Well, no one included me. So Kyle Slaby also asked, what sort of general value should I put on Justin Jefferson in my Dynasty League? Is he a, quote, prioritize him in round one type of player? I am toward the end of the first round of a 12-team league.
So I am not super great at Dynasty, but first things first, I'm surprised at how high quarterbacks go in Dynasty. I think it's kind of dumb. But second, I think they should be going actually, I think Joe Burrow should not be going in the first 4 picks just because it's a quarterback. But as for Justin Jefferson, yeah, bottom of round 1 seems about right. So obviously you've got your top 4 running backs in some order. You've got Jonathan Taylor and J.K. Dobbins, and obviously Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And then DeAndre Swift, just because he was drafted as high as he was. And then you've got your kind of, these guys can take over running backs, people like Cam Akers. Then you've got your clear top receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, even though he was in this weird position where there's a lot of receiver snaps to go around. Now that KJ Hamler's hurt, it's easier to be kind of curious about Jerry Jeudy, although of course that's not a long-term thing. And then, Henry Ruggs is competing with some people like Bryan Edwards and Hunter Renfrow and stuff like that. I would say, and then there's Jalen Reagor. So I would say that outside of if Joe Burrow falls to that spot, which is kind of where it would make sense to draft him, I would say that Justin Jefferson makes sense around 9, 10, 11. Certainly ahead of T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk and Denzel Mims and Michael Pittman. But certainly behind Jerry Jeudy. And I think Jalen Reagor is going to start right away, so he's just going to get you more value for the first 4 years. But yeah, I'm not crazy good at Dynasty. I'm pretty good at redraft, as far as somebody who's not a professional fantasy analyst can be. But I'm not crazy good at Dynasty.
Don from Ohio asks, did Arif eat the squirrel he took a picture with?
I did not eat the squirrel. What? That's disgusting. I would only eat organic farm-raised squirrel. Who knows what the squirrel has been eating? Yeah,
this is an urban squirrel. All bets are off. Also, what is your favorite Emmy Made in Japan food video? Are you familiar with Emmy? Are you subscribed?
I love Emmy Made in Japan. I don't think I'm subscribed. It just keeps getting recommended in my feed. Whatever her poverty meals series is called.
Yes,
I forget.
Those were really good. When you had water pie, and you're like, I'm sorry, what?
Right, exactly. And Prison Loaf was really fascinating.
The prison ones were really, really interesting. In fact, I had listed 2 that I thought were the best, which were the prison burrito.
Okay. So we're on the same page.
Yeah,
Great.
The prison burrito was fantastic. I sat and I might have watched that twice just because it was so interesting. I was like, why would you? How? Okay, there's some commissary at work here. Okay, and the raindrop cake, which she said just tasted like water,
yeah.
but the raindrop cake is I think her most popular video. But it
Right,
is
because
just
that became like an Instagram trend. I remember
yeah.
first seeing it on Bon Appetit Rip, and then I saw her video on it, which the Bon Appetit people were a little bit more enthusiastic, but they both clearly agreed that this is like more an aesthetic versus taste thing.
Yeah. And what's not to love about somebody who starts off their videos with "Hello, my lovelies"? So
I know, right?
Between that and the mole on her
loaf.
face,
That's
just like the mole right next to her nose, that's completely disarming. Completely disarming.
Wow, she's got a lot of. So there's the neutral loaf, disciplinary loaf from Illinois, neutral loaf, disciplinary loaf from Ohio, then cheesecake prison food, which that sounds interesting. Then she made prison hooch.
She's made wine in a couple of different ways. Watching her drink prison wine was pretty damn entertaining, admittedly.
Pruno or something, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Next question is from Kenneth Allen, who asks, what unfortunate encounter did Arif have with a squirrel as a child that has hardened his heart so?
I went to college. Anybody who's been to like a college with a substantial squirrel population, I think should hate squirrels. Like, that's normal. I'm normal. People ask me if I fed this squirrel. Of course I didn't feed the squirrel.
Eat the squirrel, not feed the squirrel.
No, people also asked if I fed the squirrel. Don was the only one who asked if I ate it. Most people asked if I fed it, and I said no. And they were like, you monster. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is a rodent. An admittedly adorable rodent, but a rodent, it's going to figure out how to eat. Like, it's fine. There's 80 of them in this park. They know what they're doing. I don't need to do this. And they harass people. And the person I was hanging out with, who I hadn't seen in like 3 years, he was feeding the squirrels. And I was like, dude, now we're going to be surrounded by squirrels. And we were, and it was very uncomfortable.
You didn't have like a Cinderella moment, or so you have the singing animals around. Was he singing to get the animals?
Snow White,
He was singing to make the animals come around, wasn't he?
To like spread disease, yeah, sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. See, where I went to school, we didn't have an abundance of squirrels. We did, however, have an abundance of wild turkeys, both the liquor bottles and the animals. And whenever you went, depending on the day, when you crossed campus, there was a decent chance that your commute on car was going to be interrupted by a herd of wild turkeys. And
incredible.
It was at one point, the building, the dorm I was in, was connected to another dorm or another building, which was like half dorm, half sorority, whatever. And there was a big parking lot, and there always seemed to be at least 4 turkeys in there. And it was always...
Were they aggressive?
There were a few really pissed off turkeys. They're angry. They're just angry, mean-looking birds, and that didn't help my opinion of them. But yeah, there was just always an abundance of wild turkeys. So much so, in fact, that when I went back there to DJ a wedding years ago, I had said that if I don't end up seeing a wild turkey or drinking a bottle of one, then this wasn't a successful trip back. And by God, I was able to do both. So I felt like that one was a bit of a success. Also,
I feel like every college that has a ton of squirrels like has some version of a joke where they're like, oh yeah, University of Minnesota, where the squirrels are smarter than the students.
Silence. I don't know. I've been on a number of campuses, and I just haven't run into an abundance of squirrels. Maybe I've just been hanging out on campuses that have like the janitor from Scrubs who just kills them and like stuffs them wherever they happen. So maybe that's just where I've been at. Kenneth Allen asks, what will cancel the NFL season? Pandemic, racial justice protests, meteor, civil war? I'm holding out for bees.
You mean murder hornets?
Nope. Just bees. The bees will overcome the murder hornets. They will find a way.
Great. So we've got that an oncoming war between the bees and the murder hornets, where the losers are us. So that.
Really, the losers are all of us in that point. Yes.
I don't think the protests will do it. I think if anything cancels the season, it'll be like a flare up of the pandemic. So, choose your dystopia.
Yeah. And stay informed. You have every right to to research the dystopia you wish to be a part of. So take your time. We realize that you have a choice in dystopias. Duke's Code asks, NDSU's October 3rd game against Central Arkansas, incredibly irresponsible or just overly ignorant? Is it worth vacating previous year's championships? And assuming so, does Carson Wentz deserve criminal charges as a result?
Well, I love the direction you're going in, first of all. The whole point of all of these, it's accountability. We want accountability, and Carson Wentz needs to be held accountable for the fact that his alma mater is going to play against Central Arkansas on October 3rd. Just, frankly, it's irresponsible of him. Second...
Can we just reverse last year's championship instead? Like, it's the same quarterback's going to be on that team. We don't even need the leap of faith, the leap of logic. Yeah.
I'm just shocked that they're playing. Like, I understand this is meant to be a showcase game for Trey Lance, but like, I don't know. Like, what is one game, like as an NFL scout, one game going to teach you, especially when it's against Central Arkansas? Like, if it's like, we were able to rope a Power 5 program into playing against us, and you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I would love to see what Trey Lance does against USC or whatever. Like, that sounds interesting. But like, as any NDSU fan likes to point out, everyone was too scared to play them. They tried to schedule a number of Power 5 opponents and they turned them down. Although I think, a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that they only wanted to play conference games, and you can control what the COVID protocols are in conference, and you can't do that out of conference. But whatever, they're scared.
If he Theismann / Alex Smiths his leg,
Jesus man,
during this game, we are going to be able to hear you gut laugh. Like
I don't laugh at injury. Come on, man. I didn't laugh at the Aaron Rodgers injury. Or I haven't actually laughed at any of the Carson Wentz injuries, except to make like oblique jokes about how he's never played a playoff game.
And there's been a lot of them. So
but I'm not laughing at the injury.
Okay,
when it occurs.
Just
I don't want people to get hurt
in the comfort of your own home. Okay, that's you're not doing it in the press box. That's respectable.
I don't want people to get hurt. That's sad. I just want Carson Wentz to never play football again on his own terms, and/or because he was arrested for letting NDSU play Central Arkansas.
Which, admittedly, there are courts that would,
right. No, but yeah, I do think that that's probably irresponsible.
Yeah. Nolan asks, I have recently acquired a new roommate. She is lovely.
Who talks like this? Nolan.
Was this at Costco, or was this at was this a Kirkland roommate? Is that a thing?
Well, the person they're describing seems like mostly pretty nice. So yeah, it could be a Kirkland.
Yeah.
Of all the store brands, Kirkland is like several tiers above. So
I don't know. I've actually never been inside of a Kirkland. My frame of reference is a Rick and Morty joke involving the Meeseeks boxes. So
no. Kirkland is the store brand for Costco. So
okay. Well, according to Nolan, he has recently acquired a new roommate. She is lovely, and I don't foresee any problems arising. That's where they get you. What passive-aggressive thing can I do to upset this balance? Bear in mind she has a severe dairy allergy, so anything involving sour cream just seems cruel. Also, what is the best food to impress a new roommate that is dairy-free and shows her I am not, in fact, a slovenly bachelor, but a modestly capable one?
Modestly capable. So for this first question about passive-aggressive, so this is more of a prank than passive-aggressive, but just doing something that is just bizarre that you treat as absolutely normal to the point where they confront you about it and you don't even know what they're talking about. Like, that's a great new roommate prank. But in terms of passive aggressive, I mean, you have to wait for them to like screw up in some way before you can kind of react, because the beauty of like really good passive aggressive roommate behavior is that it is like poetically tied to whatever the transgression it is you're responding to, right? Like like you can't like leave a post-it about dirty dishes unless there's dirty dishes, right? That's not poetic, but it's passive aggressive. You can't like do that, right? Like if they like leave their laundry everywhere instead of like putting it in a basket or putting it in a laundry machine and like washing the clothes and bringing it back to the room, you can't just start leaving your clothes everywhere too, unless they like do that first, right? So it really needs to be kind of responsive. But, you could start by like leaving every door open at all times, regardless of what's happening. That can begin to breed conflict without being aggressive necessarily. Because that's like really crazy. Like, who does that? You could invite like friends over that are just like not good to have around people. We all have friends like that. You could have friends squat at your place. That's a good one.
I don't know how passive aggressive that is, and I think.
Well, but that's what I mean. It's like you have to like respond to something.
Nonsense. I think, to be No. You don't have to respond to anything. He wants to strike first blood here, and I feel like the best way to do that is this. One of the positives of the pandemic is that it's very easy to get rubber gloves and like latex gloves.
Oh.
And what you do is anytime you get something handed to you from them, say, excuse me one moment.
Excuse me one moment. Put on the gloves.
And put on some rubber gloves. And
that's good.
And do that. Whether it's dishes. And and you can even expand this. Like if you know that they just did the dishes, when you grab your dish, make sure you have your rubber gloves on, and just
and clean the dish on your own too, right? Like,
yeah. Oh, totally.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. It's not
That's
really
good.
clean because it was done by them. So you need to put your glove on. It will drive them insane.
Well, it'll either drive them insane, or they'll be like, "Hey, you should check into a therapist because you're demonstrating some symptoms of OCD, and I'm really concerned for you." Like those are the two directions that you go in, right?
Just make sure that you turn the light off and on 20 times before you leave the room after that. Like,
right.
You can play into this just fine. She'll totally appreciate the lengths that you're willing to go to for a joke to get this to get this OCD thing going. Nope. Did I really just say one of the positives of the pandemic?
Yes, you did.
Did we brush over that?
Yeah, we just kind of skip right past it.
We're just gonna let James talk there. Great. What about the best food to impress a new roommate that is dairy free and show her that he is not a slovenly bachelor, but a modestly capable one?
I don't see how you could go wrong with like a roast. Like
crock pot is your best friend here,
right? Yeah. So that was the second thing I was going to say is that like if you do a roast is going to look good, but in terms of impressiveness to effort ratio, I was going to say slow cooker, which crockpot is absolutely like the winner here, because very limited utensils, so you don't have to like wash a ton of stuff. You just leave it alone for a while. The house smells amazing. Just make sure like you appropriately season whatever meat you're going to use. I would use kind of like a roast chuck or something like that, and a bunch of salt, bunch of pepper, and then whatever spices you think like make sense for whatever you're adding to it with like onions and carrots and potatoes. Maybe throw in like a half a cup of beef broth or chicken broth in there. Just like there's a lot you can do. And if you want, and there's ways you can increase the effort to increase the flavor. You don't have to. Like you could sear off the roast before you put it in the crock pot, for example. But yeah, just look up a crock pot recipe. That there's like tons of them, and they're so hard to screw up that most of them are actually pretty good recipes, and you'll seem like totally capable.
Yeah, 100%. What happens is when you're just out of college or just before, not even just out of college, when you're just out of high school, maybe you like just got into college, your knowledge in the kitchen is going to be lacking, and that's something that can be expected of you, and that is something that is completely reasonable. And if you're trying to give her the impression that you are not that type of person, then the slow cooker or the crock pot really is a great way to express that. There are lots of good things that you can just Google, crock pot dairy free, but I will say that one thing that you could do that she will appreciate, whether she's, whether it's kind of implied here that it's a girlfriend or wife situation, girlfriend probably, but it's kind of implied that it might be a girlfriend situation, but Lactaid. Have Lactaid available in the apartment before she comes in and be like, hey, I know you try to do the dairy free thing, whether or not that's, if especially if you know that it's a dairy sensitivity thing. Lactaid works really well. It works well for multiple people that I know in my life. So it wouldn't be a bad thing to have for that. There's even things that are as simple as like, slow cooker chicken pot pie that you can do. You can use like coconut milk instead of like regular milk, that sort of thing. Like there's plenty of options that exist for it, but it shows a couple of things, including that you have patience and that you can have like, if you're trying to do the whole not slovenly
this recipe
bastard.
took 8 hours. Surely this is a man of virtue and patience.
Well, no, that's the thing, is that when you are first starting out in the world, most of the meals are like straightforward. I've got 10 minutes, I need to do this. Whereas as you get older, it's kind of expected that you're willing to take a little bit more time with it. So this gives her the impression that you're not some sort of slovenly bachelor, that you are willing to spend some time, that you have some patience with it, and that you might at least be able to fake knowing your way around the kitchen and spices and all that. So that would be my suggestion, is go crock pot, because it'll have additional benefits other than the fact that your apartment will smell amazing for when she comes home.
There you go.
Yeah. Doug asks, just listen to the Yahoo Sports NFL podcast, and they had a great bit about the draft order if the season is cut short. I'd love for you guys to expand on the idea. I think the coaches and the GMs should all get thrown into a poker tournament to figure out the draft order. I would watch every single minute of it.
I mean, that sounds phenomenal, especially given kind of like all of the poker face analogies everyone uses about GMs. That sounds great. I love it.
What would David Gettleman like? What would he? What would he gamble in order to get a better pick?
He would definitely follow the numbers in his heart. That's for sure.
There's no question
about that. Beyond that, okay, so that's great. If the season is shortened, I think a kind of a lottery style would be kind of cool, right? Like, so you get a greater percentage chance based off of, having a worse record, but it's like not like if it's like a 3-game season for whatever reason and you're 0-3, you shouldn't automatically be, given the top pick or whatever. I mean, there's going to be a couple of teams that are 0-3, but you know what I mean? You shouldn't automatically be given the top pick, but you should probably have better odds, right? So I would say a lottery based off of where the odds kind of increase for the worst record getting the number 1 pick as the season goes on. So that I think would be a relatively fair way to do it. Obviously if it's 1 game and then you're canceled, then I would like probably mix it up or something, like do something random. But like 3 games and more, I think you could do a lottery or something where the percentages are based off of your wins and stuff like that. So yeah, but I don't know how you would. I don't know how you would do it. Like, it'd be really funny, like a blind auction, or not even a blind auction, just an auction where they have to give up like some sort of assets going forward, or like auctioning off salary cap space. Okay, I'm sold. Done. That one. That's
an option. I think 3-man sack race is also an option with the coach and the GM.
Coach and GM. So what does Bill O'Brien do?
He gets to sit there like the kid waiting for his dad to show up for the father-son picnic, and he never does. That got oddly specific. Let's go to the next question and let's ignore that. Logan, hey, we're doing a baby question again. Logan asks, we're expecting our first child September 26th. If my wife goes into labor on 9/13 during the Vikings-Packers game, do you suggest I leave the room to watch or insist/pay for it to be on during the delivery?
Jesus. Okay, so first of all, congratulations. Second of all,
nonsense. You shouldn't have had a kid to begin with.
Second of all, my birthday's on the 27th, so I might share a birthday with your kid. That sounds great.
That's a terrible idea, too.
That's not a... Okay. Third...
Sorry, I've got too many kids, and it's been a problem today.
Fair. Okay, that's fair. Given my long-standing hatred of children, I think we're more on the same side on this one, really. I was just trying to be a little delicate, as I often do.
You know, one of the positives of this pandemic has been...
It's the availability of PPE. Fantastic. No.
You know, one would think that would be the opposite, but here we are.
I would suggest probably not doing any of this, but... Otherwise, if it's really necessary, get a phone plan that has red zone on it. That's probably the best you're going to do. Like I think like discreetly checking your phone. She's holding your hand, but like looking in a bunch of directions, you're furtively glancing at your phone. It's probably if they allow, like, I don't know what the procedures are for who's allowed in the delivery room during the pandemic, but like, I don't know what that looks like. But and hey, if you're kicked out of the delivery room for whatever reason, yeah, do whatever you want, I guess. Probably stay close, but other than that.
Jesus. I'm a bad person to ask because I once watched most of a meaningless Bears game through my son's second birthday because I had money on the over for wins for the year.
Incredible.
Hey, we got a nice TV out of that, all right?
This was for us.
This was a gift for the family. Okay. Okay. I wouldn't do it. Just don't. It's not worth it. Get Hulu Plus for the weekend or whatever, the cable version of it, and just DVR that game and just watch it later. Or there are plenty of places where you can watch it after the fact. Legal or
honestly,
not. It's not worth it.
It's going to take a lot of your attention. I've never had a kid, but I promise it will. So you might not even know what's happening with the game by the time you've got the ability to pop it onto DVR. So you might have a truly close to live experience.
As it turns out, this is one of those situations where it's all about her. And like you really should
her question mark.
You really should focus on her as opposed to your own selfish needs. There will be plenty of time after that, maybe even later that day, that you can be selfish for yourself. But for that period of time, which the other thing that you're forgetting is that labor can take forever. Labor can take a really long time, or it can be really short. Some kids just want to be shot out like a cannon. Others are a little more reluctant. So there may be an option to sit and watch that while you guys are going, Jesus, is this thing ever going to come? No, it will eventually, but you're just going to be bored. Final question, and this is a question that Arif and I laughed hysterically at earlier in the week.
I'm much more qualified to answer this question than the previous question.
All right, let me just scoot in real quick just to make sure that I have a good angle on this because I want to make sure.
In a world.
Ricardo asks our final question. Says, Ricardo, good day, sirs. I have not listened to the most recent episode yet, so disregard this if something similar was brought up.
Sorry, this opening sentence. Remember that for by the time you finish this email.
Yes. So this idea for a movie/miniseries popped into my head recently. James goes missing. Given the
exclamation point.
Yes. Given the previously expressed concern regarding his well-being, example, general snarkiness, wife's access to disposal methods, etc., the police take James's wife into custody for obvious reasons. Convinced of her innocence and for plot reasons, Arif, and not some qualified law enforcement or science type person, must travel back through time to gather James's various exes to obtain information regarding his disappearance. On his quest, Arif passes through many key moments in recent Vikings history, Forrest Gump style. Perhaps Arif is on the sideline in 2009 and asks Tahi his opinion on the importance of the running game in an established play action, thus delaying his arrival in the huddle. Or perhaps Arif is lurking, for completely non-creepy reasons, in the bushes outside of Wayne's house, prompting an investigation by concerned neighbor Everson Griffin. Maybe Arif, again on the sideline, yells, "Rey is a Palpatine" at Marcus Williams during a key moment in the game. After all of this time heist adventure, Arif finally finds James in the clutches of a gang of current and ex-NFL kickers led by the one and only Blair Walsh. Enraged by all of the negative feedback they receive from fantasy players, they have kidnapped James in an effort to eliminate the Norse Code Fantasy League before its glorious rule gains more traction with others. Things can end with Arif fighting Walsh in some big CGI brawl on top of the Metrodome at a certain key moment.
Wow. Right as okay. Yeah. The 2010
Snow
Metrodome,
battle.
say late in the season.
Snow battle. You don't see very many snow boss battles. Okay.
Yeah. Props for you for choosing the one Viking I might be able to hold my own against in a fight. Thank you for that. Still taller than me, but still. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So, the questions are these. Who do you cast as the major players? Here are my best attempts. Arif would be Riz Ahmed from Arif's favorite, Rogue One.
Jesus.
Or Samir from Office Space. James would be Cameron Britton, who is Ed Kemper from Mindhunter, which a quick Google did admittedly look much more like me than I was expecting. I was expecting it to look much more like that guy who does the car karaoke, who would probably also be an acceptable one, except I would hate it.
James whatever?
Yeah.
Wait, his name is also James, isn't it?
Yeah, it's creepy. Cameron Britton or Shrek from Shrek the Third.
From Shrek the Third. Lost my mind at that one.
James's wife, Kate McCucci, half of Garfunkel and Oates. Not sure which one. Mostly for size comparison jokes. Also, she's hilarious. Blair Walsh as David Tennant. No particular reason other than he kind of looks like him. An unspecified role, Stanley Tucci, because everything is better with Stanley Tucci.
Yeah, so that, first of all, Stanley Tucci, phenomenal decision. Strongly agree. Blair Walsh, David Tennant, fantastic. I think that's really great casting. Also, David Tennant plays a remarkably good villain, so that's good too. I like Riz Ahmed. I hate Rogue One, so but Riz Ahmed actually was fine. Like,
how do you hate? No, I'm not going to get into that.
No, we don't need to get into it.
No,
but it sucks. The final third was fine, but
were you just waiting for a love story to happen, or what?
Explicitly, no. I would rather have not had anything close to one.
And there wasn't. That was a perfect... I'm not going to get into this.
No, the ending was better than the rest of the movie, but the movie was bad. So, Cameron Britton, really great. Holy crap. I did not know who this person was. I also Googled, really like the comparison. So that's really good. Shrek from Shrek the Third is funny, but I would go with Cameron Britton.
See, I would argue that although I am a big fan of Kate, and she's been a number of things that I've enjoyed, my wife would probably be more of a taller version, of the woman from Big Bang Theory, the blonde who has a bit more of a squeaky voice that's forcing the squeaky voice. No, the other one.
Okay, well, I don't actually watch, so I don't...
Oh.
There's another blonde.
Like, you say with this big, like, authority, like, oh, yes, I know exactly who that... No. Melissa Rauch.
I did not know. I know of two women in that show. It's Kaylee Cuoco and the one that looks like a super nerd that's a brunette.
Yes, me and Bialik. This would be Melissa Rauch, a taller version of that, or a blonde version of the woman from Mad Men whose name escapes me. What's her name? She would be Christina Hendricks as like a blonde would also have been acceptable.
Well, she's also played a blonde in some stuff. So
yeah,
okay, that works. Yeah, James, you're with Christina Hendricks. Yep.
Hey, this works for me. Listen. If she hears this, she needs to know that I think of her in these ways, because this is.
I'm sure that's how this will come across.
Oh yeah. If anything, I will come off as genuine. I am excellent at coming off as genuine.
Yeah, this casting is frankly brilliant.
Yes. Any other key moments that could be worked in?
Well, I think that I would have to accidentally send the text, the Brett Favre text.
Oh no!
Right, yeah. So there's that, or I could, because there's only so many Brett Favre interactions you can have for this to work out. Or I could give him the idea for pants on the ground.
Hey Brett, pick those pants up off the ground. You saw the guy last night on
fool.
Yeah. You saw the guy on American Idol, right? Get those pants off the ground.
So there's that.
Like you,
yeah, I don't know.
You convincing, or you telling Chili he needed to go pick him up from the, from the airport.
Good. I could have accidentally transmitted the game plans for the Vikings before their playoff game against the Giants. The Joe Webb game. I could have been the one that hurt Christian Ponder's arm. Maybe in an arm wrestling contest that I somehow win. It's a movie. I could do that.
Look, you say things like that, and his wife's going to block you on Twitter.
What this is? I was sad for Christian Ponder because of compartment syndrome, and then I was happy for Joe Webb, and then I was immediately very sad for Joe Webb.
You could have been the one who
just asked Joe Webb, "Hey, have you ever considered throwing left-handed? They'll never see it coming."
You could have caught the ball that Josh Freeman famously threw into space.
Yeah. What other good moments to work in?
You also could have. There's got to be a good Adrian Peterson one. That's not.
Tread carefully, man.
That's not. I was going to say that's not horrific. You could have been trying to get information from Adrian in the Houston club when he got arrested, or when people were trying to arrest him and went high
when he got
on
arrested
him
for resisting arrest.
Yeah, yes. And when people went high instead of low on him, and he just carried them like a satchel. You could have been the guy that was carried like a satchel by Adrian Peterson.
I could have been trying on Blair Walsh's shoes during the playoff game.
Oh, the Frozen game.
Right. I was like, wow, he's made every kick. I wonder if it's something in the shoes. And I just put on the shoes, and then he has to run out there. Yeah. So there's that.
All of this is all terrible. I love it so much.
Oh my God, I love it. Holy crap.
What? I'm trying to think if there's anything else that was just truly awful that we could shoehorn into this in some way.
I mean, I could have stepped on Teddy's foot as he was dropping back.
And that's where we end. All right. Well,
you said truly awful, right? Like,
woof.
I was just going in to shake his hand, congratulating him on just a remarkable preseason. Really great job against the Chargers. And then I step on his foot, and he steps back, and whoops.
No, I don't want to end on that, because that's just terrible. Perhaps you do end up having like a boss battle with Chad Greenway, though. I think
actually that's I think Chad Greenway is the red herring. I think he's the villain for most of the movie, and then it turns out to be Blair Walsh and a consortium of kickers.
One of those friends become enemies, enemies become friends.
Right, yeah.
This
and actually, when he picked sixth, I think, was it on his birthday? I don't know.
It was on yours.
Was it on my birthday?
It was on yours. I was there. Remember?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So when he picked sixth on my birthday, that was our restitution. We made up.
Yeah.
And he got the pick six for me for my birthday.
Jeez.
After I fought Blair Walsh while the stadium was collapsing.
There's this weird. There's the video from the collapse has that guy who's speeding across in the vehicle. That's you. That is you in the vehicle speeding across the dome as snow is pouring in. Like you just got through and. This has serious potential. We'll be writing a treatment for this and sending it to Hollywood producers and seeing how that goes. All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Arif, what do you have up at the Athletic?
So I've got a couple of notebooks about what's been happening at camp. I'm going to have another one published hopefully by the time most of you listen to this, although I know some of you will listen to it as soon as it's published. But that should be for tomorrow morning, and then I'm going to be heading to US Bank Stadium to be watching their in US Bank Stadium practice. So that's what's up at the Athletic. I also obviously have a number of other podcasts. Most recently recorded one with the Football Machine, as I do every week. So check those out.
All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Again, you need to get your information to me via Twitter or via email at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com if you want to be a part of the fantasy madness that is the Norse Code Fantasy League. I need that before midnight going into September 1st. So midnight, August 31st. 31st? Sure. So very end of August. You only have a couple more days left if you want to get into this insanity. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember to always bring your wine towel. And we will see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.